Thank you very much, Dory. Today we have Jim McLaughry, who is going to tell us some of his experiences. So, Jim, the mic is yours.
Yeah, that'd be fine.
Move that one head, should I?
How many of you have seen Private Ryan? Any? Some? Most? Some of us were advised not to see it because it gets too much of a trauma. Can you hear me now? Well, that's right. Bite it.
Yeah.
What do you want?
That's fine.
That's good.
Anyway, the Veterans Administration advised some of us not to see it because the trauma was so great it would set up the memories and upset the balance of some guys. None of us, of course. But anyway, when we went over Germany and on bombing missions, it was the same thing every day of doing a D-Day landing. You have to equivalent it with that because that's what we were up against every day. And often you were with a pilot, you may not know what he was doing, and you're the tail gunner, and you hope to God he was trained well, but you're not absolutely sure from what you've seen of him at breakfast. I'd like to go back a little bit because your teacher, Mr. McIntyre, suggested we take a 3-year look at one guy, which is me, today. We are all survivors. By a miracle of chance, God, whatever way you want to look at it, we are all survivors. We're not heroes. We happen to survive. And we went through a colossal amount of difficulty to survive. I was 18 when I asked the government if they liked my services. And 2 days after I was 19, they called me, and we went on a train out of Pittsburgh. They told us not to bring any clothes, so we had one little bag and the clothes on our backs. They put us on a railroad train, a coach train with no berths, no way to sleep except lie down as best you could for 3 days and 2 nights to Miami Beach. Well, Miami Beach sounds great, but it was a hotel, and they put 16 of us in each room, and one John for 30 people. That was my introduction to the Air Force. There we tried to learn how to march and to be obedient and to have some pride in our uniform, although it was 3 weeks before we got uniforms, so we had to wear the same clothes for 3 weeks. That's just a minor detail to show how far behind we were trying to answer Hitler's challenge. We were way behind. And I found the other day that over 26,000 casualties of us in training here in the United States. There were 13,000 killed just in our own training. This is Air Force training only. That's how many of us were too young, too inexperienced. When I arrived at our final base training in Colorado Springs for our phasing before going overseas with the crew, the previous night, one of the crews had made a wrong turn in the traffic pattern and crashed into Pikes Peak. So the trauma of not being here tomorrow was pretty well established once you got into the training, though I had no idea it was 13,000 guys who were killed in training. There were about 64,000 of us altogether in casualties around the whole world. So it was a deadly thing we were going into, though many of us were happy to be wearing a pair of silver wings. That was the song that made us all think it was going to be great, until we got our first reaction to the first time we were hit with flak. So I went overseas with a brand new airplane. We took a brand new airplane across the ocean. I was sure they would give us someone that had been there before because I didn't know our navigator very well, and I knew he'd never navigated across the ocean. But of course there was nobody there to escort us. They said, well, here's the route, you go. So most of us got there, but some of us didn't. They did tell us that if we missed Iceland and suddenly appeared over Norway, don't be surprised if we were shot at, because that was a German shooting at us. We missed Iceland on the way to Norway. That's how careful we had to be about what our navigator was doing. The other thing about Miami Beach, when we got there, they immediately had us out on the beach, guarding the beach. Regular guards, night and day, particularly at night though, watching for saboteurs being landed by German submarines. Someday there'll be somebody that will be able to let you all comprehend the feeling of the whole country in terms of the threat we were up against. We just lost the Pacific to the Japanese. The Germans had complete hold of Europe. And here we are getting hundreds of boats sunk going up and down in front of Miami Beach. Miami Beach had to be blacked out. You can imagine Miami Beach with no lights whatsoever. And the reason they had to do that was because the German submarines would hang out in the back waiting for some of our cargo liners, some carrying precious goods to England, would sink them out there because they'd use the lights of Miami and Miami Beach to give the shadow the outline, and then the submarines could sink them. And they were sinking them right and left. So my little concerns about not having enough clothes is very minimal compared to what we're up against. As a nation, I'm trying to say. We almost lost this war. This war was not an easy thing. It was not taken for granted, as you already probably know from the books. I was then sent to Kent State University to give us some college training. They expected the navigators, bombardiers, and pilots to have some college background. So we were sent there to get some geography and mathematics training. I feel a little bit like I'm talking to the choir out here, because all of you know what I'm talking about, and you can tell it better than I can. But anyway, for your sake, they trusted me to try to explain it a little bit. Anyway, while we were there, of course, we had to march up and down the hallways to go to our classes, and of course, there's lovely young ladies there. So in order to keep from having any problems, they made us wear our gas masks while we're walking up and down through the halls. So nobody would recognize us, and we couldn't wink at anybody either. That's warfare. Yeah. Then they sent us to the San Antonio Aviation Cadet Center, where we had all kinds of tests to see whether we could be a pilot, bombardier, navigator, or whether we would be able to handle flying at all. In the meantime, they gave us a few hours in a small airplane at Kent University there in Ohio. The whole problem, as far as a personal thing was, regardless of the German submarines, was the fear of washing out. If you went into this training and you didn't make it, you may end up doing latrine duty for the rest of the war. And that was a constant thing in the back of your mind. Were you going to make it? So you really tried the best you could. And remember, I was only 19, excuse me. But when I think of it, then I never thought of anything except I was a grown man. But as I look, when you think back on it, we were thrust into something way beyond ourselves. Next point. Well, just to tell you, as far as the date goes, we arrived in Iceland on the 4th of July, 1944. That was just a month after D-Day. We were reserves being brought back in. And because they had the sunshine up there in Iceland all day long, I remember we had to wear black covers over our eyes so we could sleep. Our first mission was to hit the V-1 sites. Now, the V-1, as you may or may not know, was the first jet-propelled type of weapon that had been developed, which the Germans had developed, and they were threatening England with this new type of bombing, which was very, very scary. I was in London on a leave with the crew, and we're sitting there in the Savoy Hotel having a drink, and all of a sudden we hear this, it sounds like a truck going up a hill, and that's what it was, a V-1. And the trick of it is, as soon as the engine quit, it would then crash down wherever it happened to be. Well, we hadn't heard it, we didn't even know about it. A bunch of kids and having a ball in the hotel. And when we heard this, all the guys ran to the windows to look out to see what it was. At that very second, the engine cut out, which means it's right up here and it's coming down right here, or off on a wing. But you never knew. Anyway, the guys who did know what they're doing threw themselves on the floor, flat face. The rest of us thought, what's wrong with these guys? What in the H is the matter with these guys? But of course, that's what it was. That's how close the near miss we had, just sitting in a hotel in London, which is what the British had to put up with for 5 years. We had none of that, so it's hard to explain it or hard to give you the understanding of what it was like. The second mission, we were sent to Singlefingen, which is the headquarters of Mercedes-Benz. They made the Mercedes-Benz made the engine for the Messerschmitt 109. And most of the other groups didn't make it, but by chance we were able to get over the weather But coming out of Sindelfingen after dropping our bombs, we were hit with flak. The navigator got a huge chunk of flak inside of his leg, which went through the inside of the skin of the inside of his leg. The bombardier came back to try to take care of him, and he said, "Oh, you just got a few scratches on your feet," because he never found the actual wound. So the navigator insisted in not taking the morphine. We carried a morphine shot under our armpit to keep it warm enough so that you had it available to shoot yourself or whoever with morphine. Anyway, at the same time, the waist gunner got hit with a piece of flak that went through his back, missed his heart, and fortunately he survived. But the other guy that was hit was the other waist gunner, who happened to be a professional prize fighter. He fought against Sugar Ray. That's how high he was. He's tall, flower ears, broken nose, Punchy O'Kane. He came from Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. And the difficulty with Punchy is whenever they woke him up to go on a mission, he thought he was in the ring. So the sergeant who had to wake him up got pummeled. So from then on, the sergeant said, "If you want him, you wake him up." So the other guys had to turn him out in his cot, roll him on the floor, and then get out of the way. Anyway, that day, Punchy lost his oxygen, so he was out. The engineer who was on the top turret went back with his walk-around bottle and revived him. But what's he do? As soon as he comes, he starts slugging. With everything else we had to worry about, Punchy is slugging the guy who's giving him oxygen. Just a little side. Anyway, we got back from that one. Another one was, this is over Hanover. We got badly hit. And two engines were not knocked out, but badly, they gave us some power, but not full power. One engine got completely knocked out and it caught on fire. We had to cut the fire out. Of course, we were way behind now. We had nobody to protect us because we had to go so slow. And we started to descend, because that's all you can do, hoping to stretch it out to get to England or the North Sea. And we were able to stay up to 800 feet. We got down 800 feet before we finally saw the coast of England. And it was a very hazy day, so we didn't even know it was there until it was right in front of you. But anyway, prior to that, those of you who remember the engines, you have to have oil pressure. And we were rigidly taught, when the oil pressure gets down to 30 pounds, feather the engine. Do not hesitate, feather the engine. If you don't feather the engine, for those of you who are all of you are mechanics, when you don't have oil, your engine gets so hot, the iron freezes to the cylinder wall. And then you end up with a propeller which is trying to cut through the air, but it's not in a position of feathering, which goes straight through the air, but it's in the side like this. So the vibration it can set up can throw you out of control. God knows what can happen. Anyway, that's why they said never let it go below 30 pounds. Well, we already had two alien engines. When we got to 30 pounds, I found out afterwards, now I'm going to jump ahead. Punchy O'Kane was back in our back praying the Lord's Prayer. He only could remember the first phrase, but he was saying the first phrase over and over again as fast as he could say it. And I found out also later that the engineer, the top turret gunner, he told me he prayed the Lord's Prayer every time when we left the initial point to the target, every time we went. That's probably why I'm still here. God only knows. Anyway, we got to that point where we had to feather. I was a co-pilot. I was a co-captain because I had checked out as a pilot, but they hadn't been given a crew yet. When we got to that point, the captain, who's a very fine, good friend of mine, we looked at each other and we're both somewhat panicky. And I was saying a few prayers, but at the same time I thought, no, wait a minute, you can get a certain direction when you ask for it. And I kind of had a sense, what's the right thing to do? Anybody want to help me wherever you come from? And I had a certain sense of let it go, don't do it. And because I didn't do it, I suddenly felt very peaceful about it. Explain that if you want to. But anyway, because of not doing it, we continued to descend, still using it just a little bit, so we kept us going. We were both preoccupied, and the first pilot asked the engineer to hold the wheel for a second, because I was preoccupied with the instruments, while he put his crash harness on, getting ready for crashing on the ocean. Now, those of you who knew B-24s, very few survived a B-24 crash landing on the water. The B-17, the Flying Fortress, had its wing underneath, so when you hit the water, the wing hit, and the people usually survived. B-24 had a high wing, so the fuselage took the impact. So we knew that was pretty chancy. Anyway, we're both preoccupied. Something made me look. We've all had this happen some occasions, even driving down the street. And I looked up, and here was another B-24 coming right at us. He had an engine out. He had noticed us. And I grabbed the wheel, pulled up. We just missed him. And that really staggered us. We got enough problems, but that happening was a little much. But anyway, in the process, it turned us off the heading. And as a result, when we got down to the English coast, suddenly trying to find our own field, much to our surprise, here's our own field right in front of us. Well, we found out after we landed, we would have had another 1.5-minute engine time on that one engine, and that would have been it. And that's what the mechanics told us. And also going backwards with the navigator, if we hadn't had that near miss, instead of hitting the bulge of East Anglia, we'd have gone north, and we'd have been up in the wash somewhere. Put that down to wherever you want to. But that was one of the most critical ones we had. All of you have had these, so I'm not the only one. I'm just happy to be asked to talk to you today. One other thing, and then this is the final mission. The tail gunner had a lot of problems with his family. He was Catholic. His parents were divorcing. He was in love with a girl, so he kept writing her 3 times a day. He was preoccupied. And because of that, when we got to altitude several times in a row, when we checked the guns to see if they're all working. And as you say, check the guns, and the waist gunner would check his, fire a few rounds. We get back to the tail gunner, and his weren't working. That happened 3 times. So he was so upset, and he was very shy, backward sort of young fellow. He was so determined the next time they would work, he accidentally fired them on the ground as a major was driving by in his Jeep. So of course the major had to bail out of his Jeep. That's how critical that was. Anyway, so now the major gave him hell. Anyway, one of his friends decided he really better take him out for a walk. Now, this is the kind of friend you need. And he told Frank that he's scared, that he himself was scared. This is the first time any other guy had told Frank that he wasn't the only one that was scared. I don't know about the rest of you, but some things you hide because you're scared somebody else will know, and then you find out everybody's the same as you are once you open the door. Well, anyway, Frank told this guy all his problems, and the long-term result was he got over he started writing his folks how to heal the breach between the parents. The next trip we were on, it was the first time we were hit ourselves by German fighters, ME-109s. 5 of them came out of the back. He was a tail turret gunner. Because of his position in the formation, he was the first one to be hit by the Germans. Now, the greatest temptation, and you guys know this better than I do, but a gunner, when he's got that kind of thing in front of him, is tempted to try to hit all of them at once. He can't help it. But because his guns were working, he was peaceful in his attitude. He held on the first one. He got the first one, who happened to be the lead. The rest of them followed the leader away when he dropped off. They put umpteen holes in our gas tank, so the gas was pouring back through the Bombay after we'd had this attack, but we were still alive. And again, we lost our hydraulics. We got back to our own base, and they said, you don't have brakes, you got to land at the Darkey station, which is an English station. We started to land over there again. We had to physically pump the flaps and the gear down to get down on that runway. The British came out on the radio and said, aircraft on approaching runway, you're at the wrong airport, go around. Well, I'm afraid I used a few words to the effect that we're not going anywhere. And we did get down, and one engine quit from lack of gas by the time before we got back to the first aid station to get the Red Cross donuts. That's just 3. And we've all had these. In fact, the guys who aren't here, who are up there, had them even worse. And some of you, they should hear from some of you who were actually PWs, bailing out. There's some stories here you guys would not believe. The only other one was when he got deep over Germany, the navigator had been in the hospital because he got the wounds. So they put the bombardier on as the navigator. And this is nothing against bombardiers, but the navigator was a good navigator. The bombardier was a good bombardier. But when we got over the heart of Germany, all 4 engines started plunking out because we had the old-fashioned hydraulic, called, turbocharger. And the oil had frozen up and we were losing all 4 of them. So we had to come out of high altitude. So we called Henry. Henry, where are we? I don't know where we are. That's a very comfortable feeling. Anyway, now I want to salute the P-51 pilots who are here and some who aren't. We fired a few flares hoping to catch the eye of some of our P-51 escort. That's a dangerous thing to do in Germany, over Germany, because you may get the Germans. But fortunately, there were 2 P-51 guys out there doing meteorology. They were out there to get meteorology for the next day's mission. They came over, we talked to them, they said, well, we don't know where we are either, but we'll go down and find out. So they went down underneath the cloud cover. Supposedly found out, came back up and let us in. We actually had to make an emergency landing at Brussels. And before we came into Brussels, as we were coming in, there were C-47s all lined up in a constant stream, bringing supplies, gasoline for Patton's army. And none of them wanted to go around, although they could see we were having trouble. And the Germans were using our radio frequency. They jammed it with jazz and put music on our control frequency. Anyway, so the P-51 pilots could see what was happening. They went off, came back, and feigned an attack on the C-47s. So the C-47s were taking off like this, and we came in happily landed. I salute the P-51 pilots. The next thing I want to say is we came back on the 21st mission, and I've got records of the different missions. If you want to see them, actually, they're written up here, and a few other things. But the last one, we had to land at a British RAF base because the weather was too bad at our own base, and our group, the whole group, landed at the Royal Air Force Base. Well, the British all flew alone. They'd go off singly at night. They weren't used to having a whole armada of B-24 4-engine airplanes coming in, peeling off and landing the way we did it. So we had to, again, go against the British, even though they were firing the red flare, the flares to tell us to go around, and we all got on the ground. We were there for 3 days, sleeping in our flying suits in the officers' club on the floor. But while I was there, I got some bad food and got yellow jaundice. So I was out for 2 months with yellow jaundice. And while in the hospital, I met these same guys that you hear about in Private Ryan. The other guys, if I break down, but the guys who had trench feet, the guys who had to walk over the bodies to get into D-Day, they were all the guys I was with. Now, I didn't go through that, I'm just telling you, that's how close that was to, well, we hadn't won the war. We had no way won the war. We were still in a very tight condition. And so after 2 months, they told me I was grounded for high altitude flying. So the next thing I knew, I got a summons, and I mean a summons from Jimmy Doolittle's office saying I was to go to the headquarters of the USSTAF, that's the United States Strategic Air Force in Europe, which is General Spots, who was the Supreme Commander in charge of both the 15th and the 8th and the 9th Air Forces, and it was based in Saint-Germain outside Paris. And I was to go and fly the Deputy Commanding General around in a C-45, which is a twin-engine Beech aircraft. Well, from a B-24 to a C-45, it was like flying a kite as against flying a B-24. And as a result of that, I took him on a trip tour of the major target areas that we hit before the war was over. This was in April '45. So city by city by city, I flew over with this man and with a Harvard historian. Each city in total devastation. Now, I'm 21 years old by then. And talk about a shock to see a whole nation with every city in absolute devastated. We did it by air, and then we had a C-47 with 2 jeeps, and then went in the jeeps to interview the people. To see the deadened faces of those Germans, because here they thought they had something going, and now obviously they were wrong. They'd made a huge mistake, but they didn't have anything going at all. It was total devastation. So immediately I'm imagining, my God, if Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, New York, Washington looked like this, what have we been saved from? And what do we need to do for the future to plan so this doesn't happen to us? And this also involved being in Buchenwald. I was there and saw the bodies that you've all seen and heard of. But the combination of that and one other secret mission, we flew a secret mission to Sweden, the general was sent there, and I had to have a passport and, with airline, as an airline pilot, and not a, because the Swedes were neutral, to find out what the Swedes would do if the Germans held out in Norway. They had some of the strongest Nazis in Norway, and there was a real concern that the Germans would try to hold out there after being defeated in Europe. That's what we were doing there. Anyway, the last thing for me was to be in front of Buckingham Palace on VE Day night, to see the King and the Queen and Churchill and thousands of people. You can't imagine, there's no way anybody could imagine the relief that nation, Britain, had that night, which we all helped to provide. I think that's about all I got to say, except if you got any questions or any corrections for anybody.
Where was the 8th Air Force station?
8th Air Force was in England, based in a place called
Pine Tree.
Pine Tree, but the name of the girls' school, what was the name of the girls' school? He took over a girls' school, a British girls' school, and threw everybody out, of course. But they did have the indication that if you needed extra service, why, they could get a maid, which was not a very good thing. They took that sign down, too.
Did you ever see Saving Private Ryan?
I have not seen Private Ryan. I will, though. My son-in-law, I'm not worried about it. I really am not. It's just that it hasn't come up. I'm looking forward to it. Did I ever see Patton? No, I never saw him myself.
No, the movie. Like, have you ever
Oh,
watched
yes,
any of those
yes.
movies?
I've seen the question.
Like, how
Movie
do you feel like how the soldiers are like depicted? Like, do you feel that?
Very, very real. Very real.
It's a question,
The actor that did that should be given a commendation. He's passed away, but it was supreme. I tried to think of myself as you are today, 18, 19, 17. You've got a future ahead of you, and I hope you take the risk. We didn't intentionally take the risk, but thank God we did. We're forced to take the risk to make the country a better country. And that sometimes takes a risk.
How old were you when you got out of the force?
21. Another question, Avery, excuse me?
I think if they'd like to get an idea of what it was like, I think you can get a video called 12 O'Clock High,
Good idea.
which is a story about a bomber base in England.
And who was the star?
Gregory Peck.
Gregory Peck. It's available. 12 O'Clock High. Oh, Gregory Peck. And there's another one called Command Decision, which Park Gable was
Oh, there's also the Memphis Belle.
a Memphis Belle.
Now that's all jazzed up, but it does give you an idea. The Memphis Belle was at my base.
It was a amazing work. That's all I want to say, but there are some few things here for all of you. I'd like to see some of them.
That was just an excellent job, Jim. Just excellent.